Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jennifer Stokes. I'm Managing Director of Development, and I'm so pleased that all of you were able to join us today. RMI's mission is to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, zero carbon future for all. And we are so grateful to all of our supporters, especially after another challenging year, for your enduring support and commitment to the clean energy transition. And we're able to bring this discussion to you today thanks to RMI's Solutions Council and Innovators Circle donor members. And I thank you to every single one of those members that are with us today and your important role in making RMI's work possible. And I'm especially pleased that we have attendees today from over 25 countries. So with us, we've got RMI CEO Jules Kortenhorst, and he will be sharing some of the exciting updates from across the Institute and the progress over the last year towards keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And Jules will also be introducing you to three of the many emerging leaders at RMI who are directing key global initiatives. Each is pushing the clean energy transition forward in different sectors, while also ensuring that transition benefits everyone. And so joining Jules today are Lara Owens, Manager of our Climate Intelligence Program, Hara Wang, Principal of Third Derivative, and Rachit Kansal, Manager for our Carbon-Free Electricity Program. After their discussion, we'll have about 20 minutes to answer questions from the audience. You can submit your question anytime using the chat feature in Zoom. You can use the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion, and any that we aren't able to answer, we're happy to follow up with you afterwards. And a recording of today's discussion will also be sent to everybody who registered for the event. And so now I will turn it over to our fearless leader, RMI CEO, Jules Kortenhorst.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and delighted to be here this morning with all of you. I would like to take a few minutes to recognize that this year was both a year of progress, but overarching still a year where all of us were confronted with the findings of the International Panel on Climate Change that published its 6th annual report, AR6. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, characterized the findings of the report as a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. So what this means for us is that we have to double down on our ambitions to accelerate the transition to secure a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. And not only do we have to work towards achieving a net zero energy future by the middle of this century, we also, and very importantly, have to drive for immediate reductions in emissions over the next crucial decade. In fact, what was so clear from this report of the IPCC is that we have to have 50% lower greenhouse gas emissions already by the year 2030, a surely daunting challenge. As you may remember, those were the guideposts for our new strategy that we laid out about 2 years ago, and that I'll review in a moment. But first, maybe on the next slide, a couple of the key things to consider. Energy is about 70% of the problem, and it therefore also needs to be 70% of the solution. And in order to hit that 50% reduction by 2030 that you can see on this diagram, we really need to drive already over the next 8 years, the cleaning up of our electricity grid, the increased penetration of electric mobility all around the world, much more energy efficient buildings, and the elimination of natural gas from our built environment, but also the beginnings of the solutions for our industries around the world that we then can hopefully bring to net zero by the middle of the century. Next slide. So in rolling out this strategy over the course of the last 2 years, and more broadly about the past 40 years, we've come to realize that RMI's deep expertise is in the energy system, in leveraging market forces and driving businesses to be part of this transition. And it was very encouraging to see at the climate negotiations in Glasgow how significantly business leaders from all around the world were in attendance and were part of the discussion and were looking to contribute. Second, where does RMI has its biggest ability to influence and drive the transition? And that is very much in the real economy, where we can offer very tangible solutions for the decarbonization of the global economy. And finally, in light of the urgency of the problem and the fact that we have to move so significantly, where does our work have the biggest emissions reductions? Where can we most quickly make a difference? Where is our impact catalytic in mobilizing other participants to the change? So all of that adds up to the RMI portfolio, next slide, which you can see here, is essentially to focus on two critical things in 5 places. We strengthen the market forces that drive the decarbonization of the critical sectors of the economy, and we do that in 5 places around the world. We deployed big data and AI to create more transparency on emissions. We help global financial institutions to mobilize their capital from high carbon to low carbon. We stimulate the innovation and incubation of new technologies in our third derivative ecosystem. And we are launching an energy transition academy to build the capacity for decision-making, particularly in the global south. And all of that helps to trigger an acceleration of the decarbonization of the critical sectors of our economy. We work in power, in mobility, in buildings, and in industry. And where do we do this? We have a significant and growing office in Beijing. Most of our people are still in the United States, where we have offices on the East Coast, the West Coast, and of course in Colorado. We have an office in Delhi and a growing set of activities in India. And we work in selected countries in the global south, where our impacts can be very significant and a role model for other countries in the region. And finally, we have a program in urban transformation that is tailored and focused on the cities, where 70% of the emissions happen, about 70% of the people live, and where mayors have the ability to make decisions and deliver. So that by way of an introduction on RMI. Let's take down the slides. And let me now ask our panelists to join us here this morning. I'm particularly excited to talk in some detail to Lara, to Hara, and to Rachid about the programs that they are involved in and the work that they are doing. And let me start with you. I'm going to start with Lara, if I may. Let me start with you, Lara. Tell me a little bit about what brought you to RMI and what you've been working on over the past year.
Thank you, Jules. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, what brought me to RMI? I spent the early part of my career working in geothermal energy, and I'm very proud to announce or to share with everybody. I mean, I was responsible for putting hundreds of megawatts of renewable energy on the grid in Africa and Central America and Indonesia. Part of projects that were sequestering hundreds of tons of CO2 per year. Now, this was, I think, a great impact, but I knew that there were orders of magnitude more that could happen, and that these were technologies that were solidly in the hands of a lot of experts that were going to continue taking it forward. And so when I was looking at think tanks that I wanted to transition my goals into, RMI was really the only choice. And so what I'm doing now is using a lot of that expertise, having been part of the energy drilling, energy exploration, and energy development fields, working with oil and gas companies to understand their methane and their CO2 emissions, because they really are the groups that have the expertise to do something about their own emissions today. And we have the economic tools to incentivize them and really put it front and center, and that they can make these choices very, very quickly. So yes, part of my major work streams is a project called MIQ, which I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about today. But the fact that RMI is not afraid to engage directly with the likes of oil and gas companies and showing them the way that this is an economic proposition is something that really appealed to me.
Thank you. We will definitely come back to MIQ because it has been an incredibly successful program over the past year, and there are some exciting things in the pipeline. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Let me turn now to you, Hara. For you, the same question. What brought you to RMI, and what have you been excited about working on over the past year?
Thank you, Jules, and really excited to be here. So my name is Hara. I'm originally from Shanghai, China, and currently working out of the New York City office of RMI. So although I joined RMI only a year ago, my journey with RMI actually started almost a decade ago. Like, I still remember the days when I was a graduate school student reading RMI's reports on grid defection and on $1 per watt solar. And it really at that time planted a seed in my brain that one day I could pursue a career 100% dedicated to climate. Unfortunately, I didn't start that way. So after graduation, I joined McKinsey as a management consultant and spent a few years in venture capital. But I would say that little seed, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying this, that little seed that RMI planted in my brain really led me back to RMI last year. My first day back in RMI was actually March 16th of 2020. So I joined in the thickest days of the pandemic and have since been co-founding and building a program called Third Derivative with the goal of building a global inclusive ecosystem to find, fund, and scale climate tech innovations. And I'll be delighted to tell you more about this throughout this panel.
Great, thank you. Definitely want to learn more about that. And then Rachid, you have been with RMI for a while. Tell us what brought you to the organization and what you're excited to be working on.
Thanks, Jules, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. Thanks for making the time to join us today. I have been at RMI over 4 years now, came straight out of graduate school, have been following RMI's work since sophomore year in undergrad, basically, and really wanted to, felt really strongly about climate action and wanting to work on it for a long time. But one thing I always struggled with was I really enjoyed, I didn't really have one lane that I wanted to use to act on climate, whether it was technical, economic, policy, finance. And the thing I loved about RMI, and I've loved ever since, is that I didn't really have to pick a lane. And so I could really go and do whatever I wanted as long as it was towards this one mission, and really jump around between different bodies of knowledge and different geographies. And I just love that stuff. And over the last year, I've been working on 2 big initiatives. One was the Utility Transition Hub, which is an open source data platform we launched earlier this year that was focused on the US utility sector. And the intention was to make the sort of data publicly available, transparent, easy to use, so that we can empower local stakeholders to decarbonize US utilities. I have since then moved to our emerging global coal efforts. So as part of that, we are standing up a global coal platform intended to be a global resource center, a center of expertise for anyone looking to transition coal across the world. And we're doing this in collaboration with partners across the world as well. So happy to talk about that more, and excited to be here.
Thank you, and very interesting to learn more about that, particularly the financing aspect that is going to be so critical. But I'm going to go back to you first, Lara, because you already mentioned the important role that oil and gas emissions, and specifically methane, play in greenhouse gases and in global warming. But not everybody may fully appreciate how important that is, why that is so important. Can you explain why we are focused on that?
On methane
Yeah.
in general, yeah. I mean, we are excited to see that methane is finally getting that recognition that it deserves. You know, it's something that is natural gas. Oil and gas is fundamentally made out of a good portion of this greenhouse gas that is leaking and making its way into the atmosphere inadvertently. But it's odorless. It's something that is very difficult to see and to understand where it's coming from. And you know, it's coming from a number of other sources, such as the waste sector and agriculture, but oil and gas has been the last 10, 20 years understanding their emissions and understanding the technology behind abating those emissions. So what we're really trying to do is implement a number of technologies, from satellites to flyover and remote sensing mechanisms, so we understand where those emissions are and tracking them properly. And finally coming to terms with the fact that our understanding of where these emissions are and how much there are has been vastly underestimated. And we do know now very, very precisely which sources they are coming from. So we can be really precise and prescriptive when we make basically standards or performance standards or best practices around abating those. So what's really wonderful is now hopefully the buyers of natural gas, those that are aware that what they consume on a daily basis has a price to pay because of the methane emissions that are coming from the energy that was used to create that, or for the natural gas that was used to heat their home, or potentially to create the power that's in their grid. So if you fundamentally knew that the emissions from methane, which are 84 times the global warming potential of CO2. So this is something over a very short period of time. If we were to remove very, very rapidly, we would be so much faster in achieving our near-term climate goals. So that's why methane is so important. Is one, it's very easy to abate, next to nothing in cost to abate, because it's basically the commodity that a lot of oil and gas companies would want to be incentivized to stop leakage from anyway. And lastly, it's something that if we can tackle very, very quickly, our ability to reach our 1.5 degree future is done in a much more rapid way, because it's like pulling a whole bunch of blankets or stopping an arterial bleed. It's the really, really low-hanging fruit. So regardless of who it is that we're working with, we know that we need to be able to specifically work with the sectors that have the tools and that are surrounding themselves with the methane leakage problem, and putting basically every lever in our toolbox towards making that major reduction.
And so you've been working on something really exciting in terms of reducing the methane emissions of the oil and gas industry, a certification scheme that I understand is building tremendous momentum. Would you share with the audience this morning the big progress that you guys have made?
Absolutely. So what we've done is really come up with a credible, technologically sound, globally applicable standard for quantifying and reducing methane emissions and differentiating all natural gas in the supply chain based on its methane intensity. So what this does is this allows all buyers of natural gas, big industrial buyers to small utility customers, to understand the effective intensity or methane intensity of the gas that they're purchasing. Now this leads to differentiated pricing. Ultimately, really high polluting natural gas will have to be sold at a discount, and those suppliers are going to have to leave the market. And the great news is, because there's this increased visibility and this increased customer pressure around the fact that methane is such a large factor and large risk greenhouse gas, we're getting a lot of producers signing up to the concept of certification. So when they undergo certification or MIQ certification, they can basically achieve an A grade, B grade, C grade, or D grade, or all the way to an F, based on how good they are at reducing those emissions. So we're seeing a lot of companies jump into the certification scheme, decide this year I'm going to go from my business as usual production and move to an A grade performance. So reducing sometimes their emissions by 90% from what they were before in terms of their methane intensity. And now we have almost 10% of the US production signed up and undergoing certification. We have the goals of doubling that next year just in the US and really reaching critical mass across the globe, because we have US gas that is basically something that's going to want to drive competition across the globe. So the more that we can get people to come on to this concept of differentiating gas based on its methane intensity, the faster the competition is going to need to catch up.
Wonderful, Lara. And I have seen you in action pitching this to oil and gas CEOs and folks on the line. Lara is absolutely amazing at making the compelling case for this certification scheme. Now, one interesting thing to touch on is that people, of course, sort of wonder, like, why would RMI want to work with the oil and gas industry? Isn't that sort of like, shouldn't we stop burning gas? What's your response to that?
It's a difficult line to walk. I won't lie. I would say that the fundamental message that I take to every webinar, to every conference, is there's no room for leakage. There's too much visibility right now, and I'm sorry, but you know, it's clear what the risk factors are for oil and gas companies. They're looking at their social and environmental and governance issues, and they're starting to recognize that they can't walk away from the fact that methane leakage is a major risk factor. So we definitely have to thank the emissions visibility work that's done over the last 10 years from all the groups that we work closely with that have made this an issue that's front and center. So there's no room for leakage. Now that they understand that that is one of the key issues that they have to address, it's really about how quickly can they do that and how can they credibly do that. So it's not really a question of us saying that in the background, the energy transition needs to take place. It's just simply addressing straightforward, right in front of us, natural gas that is on the pipeline today. We have to do something about the leakage, because we can very effectively, within days, weeks, months, cut those emissions out. And that's where the opportunity lies. So not focusing on all these other issues and what has to happen with a lot other, or many other slower moving ships. Those are all very important issues, but this is something that's right in front of us. And we can make that compelling case, not just to the oil and gas companies, because it's an economic proposition, but also to everybody who's working on the energy transition, is that there's just no room for leakage.
Yeah, thank you, Lara. And once again, we have made this point to executives in the oil and gas industry. We need to stop the use of fossil fuels. We need to stop burning natural gas. But in the meantime, while we're still using it, we have to immediately stop the leakage, because one molecule of methane is 86 times more impactful when it comes to global warming than CO2. So it is really an urgent crisis. Let me pivot now to Hara, because Hara, you work in one of the more exciting areas of RMI, still a relatively new program. And you, as you were saying, are helping many a startup in mobilizing the solutions that we need for the future. And when I see the enthusiasm in that cohort of startups, it's really quite inspirational. Can you tell us about a few of the companies that you're working with and some that we've been able to really help and that you get excited about?
Yeah, definitely. And to frame this, so through Derivative, since we started launching the program, we've worked with over 62 startups across sectors, and that's electricity, transportation, industry, buildings, as well as carbon management. I actually had the very fortunate role of transportation sector lead when I started my career at RMI. So I was in charge of sourcing as well as building together the network of support for transportation sector startups. So I'm going to bring up two examples in transportation. So the first example is more hardware focused. The name of the company is called Tex Power. What they do is they take cobalt out of lithium-ion batteries. As you all know, taking cobalt all out is not only a cost benefit, it reduces the cost of lithium-ion batteries, but it's also a critical supply chain risk. And what's exciting for this one is When we were diligencing the company, it was just 2 PhD students at UT Austin trying to spin their technology out of their labs. And then we provided the first 50K catalytic seed funding to them. It was the first seed check they were able to receive. And right now they're on the path, they have been featured by CNBC and on the path to build 100-ton scale production capacity to manufacture cathode. And this happened within a year. And another example I want to bring also from the transportation sector is an example from the emerging market. So we worked with a startup called Lodax operating out of East Africa. It's a platform of last mile electric mobility company. So what they do is they provide 3-wheeler electric cargo vehicles for last mile delivery for restaurants, for groceries, as well as for e-commerce. When we first knew about the company, they had 2 vehicles that they retrofitted. They were struggling to start the business because it was in the middle of the pandemic. We support the company with the first 100K check, and this company currently has more than 100 drivers on their platform, is expanding into new cities, and is on the pathway for 7 vehicles. It's just been, for me, it's just been an incredible privilege to be in this role, having a front row seat, seeing the growth of these entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Well, and obviously the 2 examples that you describe are so powerful, right? We've just been reading in the New York Times article after article about how cobalt in batteries is such a complication, how fraught with human rights issues, pollution issues in Congo, the mining of cobalt is, and you're essentially telling us that a solution for lithium-ion batteries without cobalt is potentially around the corner. That could make such a huge difference. And then, of course, the other exciting thing is when you talk about the last mile delivery and using batteries, that ties into our program in India, where we've launched Sunya, zero emissions home delivery for e-commerce in Delhi and beyond. So very exciting to see that. Hara, I've read so much about how much capital is becoming available for these startups, and yet we think this work is so important. Why does the money not get to the companies that it needs? What is the essential service that Third Derivative can deliver?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first off, I'm so happy. I've been a climate tech VC investor for the past 3 years. I'm so happy to see how many more funds, how many more tech investors, generalist investors are coming into this space. It's incredibly important. We need a lot more capital in this industry. But at the same time, if we were to take a step back, I think the report saying that over 30 billion VC capitals went into climate tech just in 2021 alone, but not all climate tech is created equal. A lot of capital is going into the markets that's mature, a lot of capital that's going into technologies that's mature. You see funding of Silicon Valley-based electric mobility startups, but you don't see quite as much funding going into industrial decarbonization, building envelopes and windows. You don't see as many funding going into decarbonization of chemical production. And in general, outside of North America and East Asia, there's very little climate tech VC dollars out there. So I think what we want to do at Third Derivative, at least our mission here, is to activate and create new ecosystem for entire new categories of startups. Because in order to make it work, it has to be a global solution. It has to be an inclusive solution. We have to take a climate lens, not just chasing after deal or return opportunities, but also look at what are the biggest leverage points for us to achieve decarbonization across sectors and across regions.
Thank you. And it is exciting to see how much momentum is now building behind the work that you've done. I was just this morning here at an investment company that when we explained to them about Third Derivative, immediately put up their hand and said, can you put us in touch? Because this is precisely what we need. Thank you, Hara. Very inspiring. Now let's get to the gorilla in the space, or the elephant in the room. What animal do you want to pick? Coal. It is despite the fact that, of course, methane is the most immediate lever we can pull to reduce greenhouse gas forcing, coal is still the biggest challenge, right? What are we doing about it? And what is precisely the program you're working on, Rachid?
Yeah, absolutely. So coal power generation right now is the largest single source of emissions in the world. And more than that, the electricity sector writ large, because of the key position it holds in electrifying a lot of the economy, needs to really go first and needs to go rapidly and quickly. And coal is the biggest contributor to the emissions from that sector. The good news though is that a lot of the additions to the global coal fleet have been slowing down over the last few years significantly. And so while there is still some new coal being added in parts of the world, the shift, and you might notice this coming out of COP26, has really shifted towards existing coal and the phase out of existing coal in geographies across the world. And so what we at RMI are doing as part of that is really something we announced at COP26 is this multi-partner platform called the Coal Asset Transition Accelerator. This is meant to be a one-stop shop or a resource center for all kinds of actors. They range from utilities to governments to public and private financial institutions to civil society organizations. Anyone who would like to transition, who would like to get resources to understand how they could transition the coal fleets in their regions and their countries rapidly, but also affordably and equitably. This is meant to be a resource center for that grows in scope, that grows in depth. And we're hoping to launch that early next year. And so over the next few months, we're working with partners across the world, some in the UK, some in Asia, to add meat to the bones and launch it more formally in early next year.
Great, thank you. And the other part of the challenge here, in addition to information and insight, is the financing of these transactions, right? If you are a country like Indonesia in Southeast Asia, and you've built coal-fired power plants, and now you're considering the transition towards renewables, but your plants are still relatively new, then financing that transition is really difficult. And yet we've seen just recently big announcement that, for example, South Africa will make use of funding from the developed world to help make that transition happen. Can you talk a little bit about how that works and why that is important?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the South Africa announcement was really consequential, and I'll get into that just in a second. But more broadly speaking, why are we talking about finance when it comes to the coal transition, and why does it matter? The reason it matters is the economics of energy rather, are tipping in the favor of clean versus coal worldwide. So we're reaching a tipping point in the next few years. Now, that is a necessary but insufficient condition to the transition, because over 93% of all coal is impervious to competition. So it is not enough to make renewables or clean energy cheaper in our key geographies, but that is a necessary condition to make the transition affordable. But we need more than that. We need tools like finance, along with policy and regulation, to make sure that the transition happens not just rapidly, but doesn't fall on the backs of customers and communities and workers, but rather supports them as much as possible. Now, going to the specific examples you cited, Jules. So one of the landmark deals or announcements that came out of COP26 for coal was an $8.5 billion commitment from, I believe it was the US, UK, France, Germany, EU, for a first phase to support the decarbonization of South Africa's economy, I believe. And this is really an example of, a global north to south financing support that is very much a first of its kind, hopefully not one of a kind, but first of its kind effort. And efforts like this, public finance efforts to catalyze and crowd in private capital, are going to be really important for transitions in across the global south, and that ranges from South Africa to Indonesia. And one final point I'll add is that you know, a lot of the countries that we're looking at are incredibly reliant on coal, and you know, don't have the kind of gas infrastructure that is prevalent in the US, for example. And so South Africa, for example, is 85% reliant on coal from a generation point of view. And so this kind of financing support is also a necessary but insufficient factor, and we need a lot more. But it was an encouraging start, and you know, one of the questions that remains now is, how does implementation happen? And the details really matter, and this is really where we think that RMI could play a role along with other partners.
Thank you. Well, the questions have been flooding in, so maybe a few minutes early, I'm going to pivot to picking up on a few of those and bringing them to these three incredibly capable young leaders at RMI. But if you have more questions, please post them in the Q&A button at the right-hand corner of the screen. So use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. That's easier for us to answer. And let me start again with you, Rachit. The question in the chat was about coal in India, still about 200 gigawatts, and not immediately a perspective yet to shut that down. What about clean coal? Is that a viable option? And what does clean coal really mean? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So clean coal is, it often refers to coal that is paired with some sort of carbon capture and storage. And it has been cited in sort of several instances as, you know, a potential alternative pathway. You know, I think our view is that it is just simply not feasible from a sort of, you know, economical point of view. And, you know, the transition is, you know, not only from an emissions perspective, as important as that is, it needs to be affordable as well. And so this focus on making sure that whatever, however we decarbonize, it reduces costs and distributes those costs fairly is important. And we don't believe clean coal can play that kind of a role. Now, in some, there's a broader question about the ramping down of coal versus the retirement of coal in certain geographies and what role that can play to ensure interim grid stability. That is a much bigger conversation, but probably outside that of clean coal.
Thank you. I saw a question in the Q&A that I'm eager to respond to, and that is the question about why are you even still working with the oil and gas industry? Shouldn't we be shutting down oil and gas production immediately? And isn't it in some ways the wrong choice to be reducing methane leakage when the better thing to do would be to just shut down the production of oil and gas? And our perspective at RMI is that immediately and fully and completely shutting down oil and gas production around the world is not practically feasible. We cannot tomorrow stop all the production of oil and gas, and as a result of that, the associated leakage of methane. That would mean that we would live without heat, without ability to move around, without electricity in much of the world where gas is used as power generation right now. We need to make a fast but deliberate transition from oil and gas to renewables and to low carbon energy solutions. But in the meantime, we cannot afford a molecule of natural gas to leak into the environment. We cannot afford any methane leakage because methane is 84 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas. And for that specific reason, yes, we do work with the oil and gas industry to drive down their emissions, but we make it very clear to them, look, we're going to help you stop the leakage, but in the meantime, we're also stopping you from selling this because we're building out renewables, we're taking gas out of the built environment, we're moving away from fossil fuel power systems, energy systems in the broader sense. So I hope that answers the question. Jennifer, please jump in if you are ready to pose another one of the questions.
Great, happy to do that. So one of the questions that's coming up is, as a regular lay person, what can somebody do in order to make the biggest impact on climate change? So I wonder, maybe Rachit, if you could start off with us.
Sure, I think it depends on where you live and the sort of political system that you operate under, that you're living under. I think if, in sort of, I mean, this is sort of my more, I guess, a personal view on it, but if you're in democratic countries, I think voting and making sure that you are voting sort of for aggressive climate action and climate action that doesn't leave anyone behind. Another lever as an individual that I personally have actually recently shifted my personal finances and personal investments to more climate aligned funds. And these are really cropping up all over the place, both for retail investors and institutional investors. And so I would say that is probably the second most. And I think that is generally accessible to folks in most geographies. And then finally, this one gets cited a lot, but diet, I still think that is, something that, we all eat. So that is in the control of everyone.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add to that, Jennifer, is I love meeting people from around the world. I have traveled a lot for my work. I enjoy going on vacations. But I'm very conscious that by far and away the largest part of my carbon footprint has been my travel. And over the past year and a half, I've come to realize that actually working remotely, as we're doing today, is such a powerful way of engaging. And that doesn't mean that we should never see each other in person anymore. On the contrary, but reducing my travel is certainly one part of how I'm going to see my emissions footprint reduced.
Thank you. One other question that's coming up in a variety of ways is around the impact on financial markets. And all of you are influencing those in your work. So if you can talk a little bit about where you see the impact of your work in financial markets, and maybe Lara, starting with you.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. I would say that this is having the biggest impact, or vice versa, on the investment community. A lot of oil and gas generation, especially in the United States, is funded based on small investment back groups. And what they're looking for and asking for now is better ESG compliance from the groups that they're financially backing. And we're really happy to now give them a better set of tools and a better set of metrics and a better set of targets that they can specifically ask for from those oil and gas producers and those pipeline builders. So the markets are, I would say, are ultimately going to be the ones that are going to drive the demand. But right now, for those that have the tools to actually make and influence the reductions of emissions, it's really the investors. So this kind of feeds well back into the previous question: is what can you do as an individual? Vote with your pocketbook. If you're going to be investing in any group funds, look to see what they're doing with that, and they may have the immediate influence of asking oil and gas producers and operators to reduce their emissions from the get-go.
I'm also happy to add a little bit my perspective working with Third Derivative as well. So I think I mentioned earlier that we have a role of provide catalytic funding in small check amount in the seed stage for the startups. And another role we do is actively making introductions and supporting these startups to be prepared for later stage funding with venture capital investors and commercial funding sources. And today, our cohort startups have raised a total of 200 million plus from the VC community and from the commercial funders. And an important role for us is actually to educate and bring awareness to all the funders out there that many of the technologies are ready. They exist in the lab. A lot of entrepreneurs are working on them, and provide that clarity, provide that awareness that we have these technologies. We just need to provide them the support so that they can scale.
Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, go ahead.
I'll just, this is a really interesting question. There's obviously a huge role on the global coal phase out side, but that's still very much emerging. But maybe I can talk a little bit more about the engagement we've done with Utility Transition Hub through our RMI Center for Climate Aligned Finance. We've engaged significantly with a lot of investment banks and other institutional investors. And, I just want to, I think one very interesting role that, RMI is exploring is, how can we bring more clarity around the climate alignment of investment portfolios and what role data can play there in bringing that kind of transparency. And so that has been really valued by a lot of the financial institutions we've spoken to. The data in the Utility Transition Hub, it's freely available, it's publicly available, it's granular, it's high quality. And there's been such a it's like the ESG space is like the wild, wild west, and it's been like 100 different, indexes. And, what does verifiable, credible ESG or, climate aligned investment look like? And the one last thing I'll just throw in there is, at least in the US space, I think this is like understanding the climate alignment is the first step. The second step is, recognizing how how that translates to the tremendous, realizing the tremendous investment opportunity. I mean, just as a high level number in the US utility space, or in the US energy space at least, there's between a $1 to $2 trillion investment opportunity by 2030 in just wind and solar, and between 3 to 5 trillion by 2050. And so there's, getting this right translates to not just rapid emissions reductions, but also potentially significant investment returns.
One set of questions are coming up really around implementation, and we're seeing this across the board. A lot of commitments are coming out, whether it's at the corporate level or whether it's at the municipality level. And so thinking about how municipalities can play a larger role in the energy transition, there are some examples in the questions coming up about a coal plant being shut down, but then nuclear coming up as more of an option from the community. And so can you all comment on really how do we intensify our efforts to electrify heating and transportation, but not jeopardize that by having an increased carbon intensity in the grid?
I will start, Jennifer, and then others can jump in. It is a careful dance, right? We need to do all of these things. We need to do them ideally in the perfectly right order, but we're also running out of time. And therefore, there is a risk of the perfect being the enemy of the good. In an ideal circumstance, we would first completely decarbonize our electricity system so that we have clean electrons, and then make use of those electrons in mobility and in the built environment, knowing that thereby we would achieve the biggest results and the most impact. But we're also in a hurry. We need to reduce emissions by 50% already by the end of this decade. We need to be net zero by 2050. And that requires a massive turnover of the capital stock. We need to replace all the internal combustion engine cars with electric vehicles. We need to replace steel mills that work on coal with steel mills that work with hydrogen. We need to replace all of the airplanes that currently pollute with new airplanes. So this capital stock turnover is going to be with us for a period of time, and we can't do it all sequentially. So in our view, we have to move along in all of these sectors at the same time. And yes, in some places where the electricity grid is not yet as clean, where coal is still a big part of the emissions, we may not see immediately the reductions we would like to see, for example, in China. But on the other hand, by building the electric vehicle industry and the battery industry, China is playing a huge role in shifting that whole sector to scaling up more quickly. So in that sense, they are contributing to the solution. We essentially need to do all of this alongside each other at the same time.
And so I wonder, Hara, if you want to think about the technologies that you're seeing that can help accelerate that.
Yeah, it's a tough question. We all understand that it's a tough dance to make sure that everything is coordinated. And then I would like to just here add a perspective from working directly with startup companies. We work with startup companies in making introductions to corporate partners and investor partners so that they can scale and commercialize. And we also understand that this is a very tough work because it's a very delicate dance to understand the varying priorities and varying initiatives among all the different corporate partners and investor partners. And in many cases, innovation requires serendipity, a stroke of luck, and then just getting the right folks from different parties in the same room so that they can work towards the solution together. So in our capacity from Third Derivatives perspective, what we can do is be the hustler, be the cheerleader for these startups, get as many introductions to the table and open as many doors that we can provide for them so that they have a better chance of success. And I hope that this is a good perspective to round out that question.
Thank you. So a lot of questions are coming in around methane, knowing that it's not just coming from the oil and gas industry. And so can you speak a little bit, Lara, about how RMI is thinking about methane from other areas? And coupled with that, some questions are coming up around sort of the name, blame, and shame strategy. And so can you talk a little bit about how RMI is approaching those that we do have evidence that there are leaks and how we're approaching that versus some other strategies?
Sure. I mean, all sectors that deal with methane are, important. We're definitely not picking on any one group. We're just looking for where the opportunity exists. So, just to recap, I mean, if you were to avoid all the methane emissions from the entire oil and gas supply chain, we're talking almost 7 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. That's the same amount of emissions as the whole transportation sector. That's like taking every car and truck on the planet off the road immediately. So we're really focused on where opportunity is. Landfills is another area that we are dedicated to working on. But what we want to be able to do is get to the point where we know where the emissions exist and we know what the technologies are for diversion and for abatement from existing landfills. And using those same set of tools that brought us to the point that we are with oil and gas, in able to very precisely fix the issues that exist, we're trying to achieve with the waste sector. So that's a project that RMI is dedicated to working on and has been starting over the last couple of years. So what is important to understand, kind of getting back to the question about what is the strategy for naming and blaming and shaming. Visibility is really the heart of how we get to any issue. We have to be transparent, we have to be open, and we have to have an open dialogue as to where the sources are and what is the opportunity. So what we really want to be able to do is focus on the clear facts, and that could be where the companies are most responsible or where the countries are most responsible, which segments of the oil and gas supply chain or the waste sector are most responsible. And then we just focus on the solutions. So when you're really focused on transparency and attribution, it's not really a shaming issue. It's just about transparency and facts and understanding on a global basis that the policymakers and the NGOs and the buyers and the consumers are all talking from the same playbook.
Great, thanks. So as we come into the last 5 minutes of our conversation, 2 quick questions. Well, answers probably aren't quick, but recognizing the time that we have. With everything that's coming out with policy in the US, but also across the world, thinking about the impact of policy in each of our work. But I also want to give Jules a chance to talk about hydrogen. And so maybe Jules, if you can talk a bit about hydrogen, and then let's have a few minutes of reflections around how policy influences our work.
Yeah, hydrogen is really a significant part of our work in our industry program now. It is very exciting to see how the cost of hydrogen is dropping incredibly rapidly and how much momentum there is behind significant, very large-scale investments in hydrogen. At the climate negotiations in Glasgow, we were part of a big global announcement of 45 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity being prepared for investment by the middle of this decade. That was significantly more than we had expected, that we had hoped to see. And it is an indication of the fact that with very low cost of renewable electricity, producing hydrogen through electrolysis, which is a clean way of producing hydrogen as a molecule that can power many of the systems in our economy, is now very promising. So that is exciting. And for policy, I'll hand it over to the others.
I can jump in here. I think, as important as the role of finance is in sort of, at least for the global coal phase out work, policy, and it's not a panacea, and policy and regulation are also really important tools in that. I will also, especially I think if we, not only from achieving a rapid and technically feasible transition, but especially an affordable and equitable one. And, in many cases, the financial mechanisms that we're discussing may need public oversight, public governance, public leadership, and those public actors could range from national governments to state governments to regional governments to bilateral institutions and multilateral institutions. And so it's very much intertwined, and it needs to be considered all together, in my opinion.
Thank you all so much. Our hour has gone by very quickly, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today and for your questions. There's quite a number of them that we weren't able to answer. And so we will take these down and work on some answers for you, especially if we've got your contact information. And if you have any additional ones, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we can follow up with you. It is the giving season, and so we do invite you to take advantage of our challenge match and make a gift to RMI. Before the end of the year, it will be matched up to 50%, or in the next 48 hours, we are matching all gifts 100% up to a challenge cap of $25,000. So during this critical time, I am so grateful for all of our emerging leaders for joining us. Among the many of our staff at RMI, we were really excited to have you. And thank you to each of our donors for supporting RMI's work, but also for the many cities and individuals across the world that are making this happen every day. We are really grateful for your work. And Jules, thanks for hosting our conversation.
Thank you all very much.